Picture your favorite cousin. Now picture they married your dad. Welcome to Habsburg, Spain, because that's the story of Eleanor of Austria, and now I'm going to tell you all the details. Eleanor of Austria, or Infanta Eleanor of Castile, was born November 15th, 1498, and she died February 25th, 1558. She's the oldest child of Philip the Handsome and Juana la Loca, and had the title Archduchess of Austria since birth. And since their oldest child was a girl, Philip and Juana always saw her as a powerful marriage pawn, so one day she would marry a king and become a queen somewhere. From the time she was a baby, they had her betrothed to half the continent at one point or another, including to King Henry VIII before he married her aunt Catherine of Aragon, as well as the Polish king, some dukes, and a couple of French kings, including Francis I. And though it wasn't any of them that got her hand, it still was a very chaotic mess. As a child, she was really well educated at the court of her Aunt Margaret, until, of course, her father died and then she went to Spain with her brother Charles. Which honestly must have pissed her off because her and her little German boyfriend were hanging out a ton, and when Charles found out, he was so pissed. Frederick was lower born than Eleanor, so when he declared his love for her, her brother Charles was like, "Get the fuck out of here, dog." Eleanor, being his oldest sister and the oldest infanta of Spain, he was like, "You are not marrying someone beneath you, be so fucking for real." And then he made the two of them swear in front of court officials that they never got secretly married, and then he banished Frederick. And Frederick actually does loop around again in the story when he gets an imperial election and then marries Eleanor's niece, so we'll talk about that when it comes up. But we're not on that side quest yet. Right now, Eleanor is single at her brother's court and in negotiations to be married off to her uncle Manuel, who had been married first to her mother's older sister, Isabella, and then when she died in childbirth, married her mother's younger sister, Maria. And when he married Maria, they had 8 children, 8 of Eleanor's cousins. One of those cousins, actually John, was discussed to be betrothed to Eleanor, but he ended up marrying Eleanor's youngest sister, and Eleanor married his dad instead. And I know what you're thinking, bitch, this is disgusting. What the fuck are you talking about? And honestly, you're so real for that. And look, it obviously was not a love match, this is completely political. Since the Spanish didn't really love Charles, and Charles wanted to avoid the Portuguese joining in any rebellions against him, he married off the king to his sister. So Manuel and Eleanor get married in July of 1518, and they have a son, who would unfortunately die like a year later, but then they do have a daughter who survives. But the marriage would only last like 3.5 years before her husband Manuel dies, and she goes back to the court of her brother. And in Portugal, her stepson/cousin takes the throne and marries her little sister. And so she's just chilling for a bit. A few years pass until her brother Charles needs to marry her off again in a treaty with the French. They reinstate the betrothal between Eleanor and Francis I, and Francis I is also in captivity with the Spanish, so it's kind of a whole thing. But in 1530, Eleanor has to leave her young daughter Maria behind and goes to live her life at the French court, sending little Maria to go live at the court of her half-brother/cousin, King John III of Portugal, where she would be raised by his wife and queen, her aunt Catalina, and wouldn't get to see her mother again for almost 30 years. Her mother, Eleanor, and King Francis were married July 4th, 1530, and she was crowned Queen of France a year later. And the marriage sucked ass, too. The king very openly preferred his mistress and often just ignored Eleanor. Eleanor turned her attention to charity and raising his 2 daughters from his previous marriage. And politically, she did not have much power in France. However, foreign policy, she was a vital tool, since all 5 of her little siblings were either emperors or queens across Europe. So like if Spain's acting up, she's calling up her brother Charles. If Hungary starts wildin', she's on the horn with her sister Mary. Big sisternum, like knock that shit off. So she didn't really love France or honestly being married, but she's married for a pretty long time until her husband Francis I dies in 1547 on his son Henry's birthday, which must have been a crazy day. Like,
happy birthday. Also, your dad's dead, but you're now the king. Huzzah.
So Eleanor is now widowed, and her stepson Henry and his wife Catherine de' Medici takes over as the rulers of France. And a year later, Eleanor takes off for Brussels. And the Habsburg family has a lot of drama in and around this time, and her brother Charles abdicates the throne a few years later in 1555, and then she went with him and their sister Mary to Spain in 1556, living out her days with her sister Mary and often visiting her brother Charles, until 1558, when she traveled to see her daughter Maria for the first time in 28 years. And the 2 women were very, very excited to be reunited. And after that heartwarming reunion, Eleanor would contract a deadly virus and die, losing her battle to illness February 25th, 1558, dying at age 59. And her daughter Maria would go on to be the richest princess in Europe, ball out all the time, and die childless, refusing to give up her wealth and properties to some man. And she was so real for that. And that's the story of Eleanor of Austria. And the second child is actually Charles V, the one who becomes the Holy Roman Emperor and inherits all of this shit from his very powerful grandparents. on both sides. So we're actually going to skip over him, save him for last, and instead we're going to move on to Isabella, who becomes the queen of Denmark and Sweden, and then her husband gets overthrown, and then they have to leave, and it's like a whole thing. So if you're enjoying playing in the Habsburg mud with me, I'll see you in the next one.